Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Armeni. I'm the Executive Director of Transform Finance and the convener of the Transform Finance Investor Network. I am delighted that you're joining us today for this webinar with the Boston Ujima Project to talk about the deep democratization of capital. Housekeeping, if you are joining us from a phone line only, you will not be able to see the slides, of course, but we'll be talking through them. You might want to join us via the WebEx platform if you want to see them, and we can share the recording with you afterwards. You should be automatically muted when you enter. Please feel free to unmute yourselves if you would like to speak up, or you can use the chat function that is in the platform also. And we welcome your questions. We'll try to take them at the end of the presentation by Aaron and Nia. Feel free to reach out to the Transform Finance chat box if you have any questions for us meanwhile, or to the group at large if it's something that addresses the whole group. So for today's webinar, we will have a presentation by Aaron Tanaka from the Center for Economic Democracy and Nia Evans from the Boston Ujima Project. And we'll then be joined by Jed Emerson from Blended Value, that needs no introduction, who will be offering some remarks on his involvement with the Boston Ujima Project and considerations around the work of the Boston Ujima Project and the purpose of capital, the book that Jed published late last year, and there will be a link to that. Before we get started, a couple of very quick Transform Finance updates and Transform Finance Investor Network updates. We have, as you might have heard, a couple of research opportunities available. We're actively recruiting at the moment for a research manager, somebody that can help lead all our efforts to catalog, analyze, and disseminate many of the social justice and finance intersections that we have been exploring over the last 5-6 years, as well as a lead researcher on community-centered capital initiatives of the kind of the Boston Ujima Project. So if you know of anybody who is interested in helping us think through, analyze, and write about community-centered and grassroots capital approaches, please send them our way. For the members of the Transform Finance Investor Network, our next webinar will be on January 30th with our friends and colleagues at Accountability Council to talk about community feedback mechanisms of the sort that you see in multilaterals and in development finance institutions for accountability, ombudsperson type of elements, and how those should be incorporated in private impact investments and beyond. So it promises to be also a fairly interesting discussion, and we hope you can join us for that. As for today's topic, democratizing capital, something not surprising probably that we're diving into now, and we're really excited to have seen the Boston Ujima Project launch its fund recently and come on the scene as one of the most promising initiatives for this deep incorporation of racial, economic, and social justice generally in their specific context of the work that they have been doing in Boston. So we want to look into that, see what it means for the best practices in this space, how investors can both get involved, but also take the learnings of the work that Aaron and Nia and now Lucas have been leading on the fund as an example of what would be best practices throughout their activities more generally. The broad context is probably familiar to us all, right? It's a matter of wealth extraction and wealth inequality, in particular from communities of color, low-income communities, a trend that is getting worse. But it's a trend that is not just a matter of resulting in a lack of capital or not the adequate type of capital being available for, say, entrepreneurs of color. The way that we've been looking at it from the general Transform Finance principles of community engagement in design, governance, and ownership, non-extractiveness, right, the creation of more wealth than what is taken out of a community, and fair allocation of risks and returns, we can't just be looking at the capital. We need to look more at the structural issues, the issues of agency, the issues of power, the issues of accountability over the capital, and ultimately rethinking who gets to call the shots when investment decisions are made. This is a fundamental element because the process itself by which the decisions are made, I believe, as we'll see with Aaron and Nia's presentation, is as important as the presence of the capital, right? We're trying to parse out a little bit this difference between just saying more money will be the solution versus for money to be part of the solution as opposed to simply being part of the problem. It needs to be conceived in a different way. It needs to be controlled in a different way. The governance over it is as important as the flow itself. And I think you'll all find very instructive and inspiring the deep organizing perspective out of which the Boston Ujima Project and the current fund came out. So let's keep an eye on these questions, especially as we try to consider some of the findings in the broader context of your capital allocation beyond one specific fund, right? What are these pieces that need to be in place in a community or in a capital allocation or capital aggregation context that need to be set up and structured a bit differently, right? What needs to be in place also in the community itself? Is it a matter of there being power, or is it a matter of there being political power, political will, community organizing in the first place? And is it also a matter of that power being created through the tool of adequately engaging the community in the process itself? One consideration that often comes up when we think about efforts such as the Boston Ujima Project, the Buen Vivir Fund, and Democratizing Capital East Bay, other examples that we've brought up for the Transform Finance Investor Network, is the issue of scale, right? Some of these things are deeply localized in the case of Ujima and in the case of DCEB, less so for Buen Vivir Fund, but are very much at this deeply intentional, small amounts of capital, not in terms of the impact they can have on a specific community, in terms of the capital that is swirling around the world in general, right? 85 trillion AUM versus a few million in this fund. So is it going to be an issue of scaling? Is it going to be an issue of managing to replicate the right elements of this funds, so that we can get to a significant level of pushback against more conventional capital without losing the richness of the process itself? That's the piece that we're always insisting on, right? There are some things that you can't just speed up and turn into a hockey stick or Lord knows what, because for them to be particularly meaningful, there hasn't been a way really to do it without this time investment, conversation, consultation, etc., that the one can simply say, I'll take this from here and I will do it in 100 other communities tomorrow, expecting the same results because of the local context, the local richness, and the process itself being part of what is ultimately outcome determinative here. The last piece that we'll leave as a consideration that I hope we can explore in the questions and answers section of this webinar is for the investors themselves, right? For the asset owners that are here. What does it take for their role to be performed differently? And we think from the experience that we've seen so far that there are at least a couple of elements to it. One is the reconsideration of risk, not from a perspective of how little risk can I bear so long as there's somebody else that I can punt it onto. But am I in the best position to bear a certain amount of risk because of where I sit? And how does that work in practice? How can I incorporate that redefinition of risk with the rest of my investments, as well as a rethinking of power, right? As part of our broader inquiry into sort of investor primacy, let's call it. While the capital is needed and is a fundamental element of the success of many of these initiatives, that does not mean that decision-making should rest with the investors, and with that decision-making, the power that is associated with it. And I hope that Aaron and Nia and Jed in his comments will be able to help us think through a little bit this reconception of power, how to see it, how to have power flourish in the community itself, rather than being than seeing an investment mechanism as a way of further concentrating power decision-making in the investors themselves in the more traditional way. And for that, again, I remind you of the analysis that we all did as a group in the context of the Ujima Fund that very much tried to get to that to the issue of power. Lastly, we want to look at this from our institutional perspective as part of a broader lens on these elements of community-centered capital. So as many think through place-based impact investing initiatives, municipal level initiatives, we are trying to do a little bit of a taxonomy of the efforts that are currently out there, the ones that might come up. We want to catalog some of the successful examples and some of the ones that are now coming on the scene. So if you have, if you've been exposed to any of the projects that are happening and maybe are less familiar on the circuit, please do reach out to us, because we would like to hear and be as inclusive as possible of the various initiatives that are happening out there. So with that, I will turn it over to Nia Evans from the Boston Ujima Project. Nia, give me just 1 second to pass the slides to you.
Okay.
And there you go. Thank you so much for joining us, Nia. Really excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for inviting us to talk about Boston Ujima Project. So for everyone who is participating in this webinar, my name is Nia Evans. I'm with Boston Ujima Project. I'm Ujima's director, and I work with a staff of 4. Work with Lucas Turner Owens, who's our fund manager, Sarah Jacks, who's our communications organizer, and Hendrix Berry, who is our fund strategist. And then we also have a very active membership body of about 400 members that work to continue to create what Ujima is and what Ujima will be, which is building a cooperative economic infrastructure in Boston. And as Andrea has talked about, when we think about who is at the center of that structure, for us in Boston, it is working class people of color. We just launched the first Democratic Investment Fund in the country, and so we're very happy about being able to achieve that particular piece of our strategy. And just to add a little bit of local context to the framing that Andrea gave, for those of you who are not familiar with Boston, there's some unique and not unique elements of our political situation and our struggles. So I think something that's been talked about often nationally is the racial wealth gap in Boston. And so a figure that's been much discussed is the median wealth of white families versus the median wealth of Black families in Boston, and the difference between that is $250,000 versus $8. So that's a stunning statistic once anyone hears it, particularly people in Boston. And so that statistic has been the catalyst for a lot of recent work here in Boston. Just wanting to dig a little bit more into the report that generated the statistic, and that was from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and that was in 2014 or 2015, I believe, when that report came out. So it's also a report that I highly recommend, very accessible report that's very meaty. And so when we dig into that a little bit, that report looked at liquid assets. It also looked at stocks, mutual funds, retirement accounts, checking and savings accounts, and it also looked at debt. So when we think about that median wealth number, And we dig into it a little more. What we also see is that across the board, white households in Boston just own a lot more assets than non-white households in Boston. And then we also see that non-white households in Boston surprisingly don't actually necessarily have more debt, but the debt that non-white households do have is costlier. So just wanting to add a little bit of texture to what's happening with us locally. That's the backdrop for the work that we're doing here. Another piece that I really want to touch upon is the affordable housing situation here in Boston. The mayor has an updated housing plan. So there's an updated plan to build 60,000 new units in Boston. And that plan is pretty badly mismatched with residents' needs and incomes. So with the updated plan, what we see is being built is 47% housing that addresses the upper income of Boston's population, 38% that addresses the upper middle income, 10% that addresses the moderate income, and 5% that addresses the low income. And what we've seen that current Boston residents actually need is far more in the low income and the moderate income category. So we see that the need in the low income category is 27%, moderate income is 17%. And then we see that it's on the lower end for upper middle and upper income need with what residents actually need based on what the current income is today. And so Andre has talked about this nationally a little bit, but we see that it's particularly pronounced here where there's a mismatch between what's being created, what's being built, what's being invested in, and what the needs actually are. There's a huge racial disparity in the assets that households in Boston own. And then there's also a huge disparity in the cost of the debt that white households and non-white households in Boston undertake. So that's a local context I just want to make sure you understand before I turn it over to Aaron, who will give an overview of the Ujima ecosystem itself and within which the Ujima Fund is housed. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nia. So hi, everyone. My name is Aaron Tanaka. I'm the director at the Center for Economic Democracy. These he, him pronouns. First of all, just want to thank Transform Finance again for hosting us and for all of you to join. I'm just scrolling through some of the names, and it's great to see a lot of early supporters, both through philanthropy and moral support, and as well as hopefully meeting a number of new people in our space. And so, again, we're very thankful to be here. Okay, I just want to make sure. I'm having a little bit of, Andre, you're concerned about glitches on the technology, but let me know if there's any issues happening, because it's kind of, something's happening on my side. Okay, so I'm gonna plow through though and jump right in. So first of all, Nia, thank you for kind of updating us or giving some of the context of Boston. I would just want to share a little bit about my background as well as Nia, how we connected. So my background is as a community organizer. I was the executive director of the Boston Workers Alliance, which is organizing under and unemployed workers across Boston, and particularly people who had criminal records. And I did that work for 8 years. And in addition to helping ban the box in Massachusetts, which was one of our major campaigns, we got involved in actually supporting worker-owned cooperative business development, particularly by people who had barriers to employment, who were formerly incarcerated or experiencing homelessness. And so a lot of my interest in getting into the impact space really came out of kind of a movement, social justice context, and then trying to understand how we could actually engage our own membership and our communities in building our own economic futures. And a lot of our work was actually involved in, again, helping formerly incarcerated people build their own worker-owned cooperatives. And in that process is where we really started coming across the question of what the challenges that we face in relation to financing and business development. And so my background is really coming out of the community organizing and social justice sector, and then stepping into finance over the last several years. So what we'd like to just sort of get into is really like, what is the vision for Ujima? Where did this come from? So Ujima really started as out of a study group, coming out of a number of grassroots organizers that I was involved with after leaving the Boston Workers Alliance. And I had the opportunity to become the first staff person with the Boston Impact Initiative, which is one of Boston's first place-based impact investing funds that was starting to actually pioneer integrated capital through debt, equity, and loan guarantees in our place. And part of the question was, how could we actually be involved in helping bring together some of the movement organizations, the social justice organizing groups that were actively fighting a number of the campaigns and fights across the city, but actually to start thinking about how can we stop only resisting and actually moving into building the future that we are all demanding. And so we had a study group starting in September of 2014, which involved over 40 organizers from across the city, as well as impact investors, foundations, and business owners. And this study group essentially led to the longer-term envisioning of what Ujima could be. But you know, what part of the key thing that we talked about as we were sort of going through the number of opportunities for how we could think about investment was really asking, not simply, again, as Andrea was talking about, how do we move money to communities that have had barriers to access to capital, who have experienced historical extraction, but how do we actually not only move money in the communities, but build a different kind of community control so that finance could be a tool for the social movement organizations, not simply a strategy for building wealth in our communities, which was also necessary. And so Ujima is a Swahili principle, one of the Kwanzaa principles in Swahili for collective work and responsibility, and really speaks to this idea of solidarity and power that we're interested in holding together. So next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so just really briefly, the vision for Ujima is to build a community-controlled business and finance ecosystem that brings together and centers working-class communities of color, and essentially pooling our capital and collectively determining where that capital flows to meet our own needs. So rather than purely chasing profit as individual investors, we're actually allowing communities to actually engage in the question of where capital should flow, what the priorities and needs of our neighborhoods are, and enabling those of us who don't necessarily have control over our own personal capital in a large way to actually start engaging in larger pools that we draw together. And this is really our effort to start aligning finance capital and investing strategies with advancing social movement organizing in the city of Boston. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just have to say, like, the computer's kind of tweaking for me, so I think it's still working, but I hope someone will tell me if I'm just talking into the into the ether. Okay, so Boston Ujima Project, thank you, Mandy Freeman. Boston Ujima Project is a multi-stakeholder strategy. And as we said earlier, part of the goal is to actually bring together folks from different sectors, from the community organizing sector, the impact investing sector, with local residents, with businesses and entrepreneurs. And I just want to speak really briefly about how we started envisioning how this community-controlled and governed ecosystem could function. So I'll just start with impact investors because I was the startup manager again for Boston Impact Initiative, which was founded by Deborah and Michael Fries, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with the amazing work that BII has been able to do. And in my role as the first staff person, a lot of my function was finding deal flow. And so what we've learned is that for place-based impact investing, one of the biggest questions is where do we find the opportunities? And I think, you know, Deborah brought me onto the team in large part because I was connected to the grassroots organizing sector coming out of working in Roxbury and Dorchester, which are predominantly Black and people of color neighborhoods. And I had relationships there. And I was able to help generate some of the opportunities for us to invest in. But we realized how heavy of a task that was and how much time it took. And so part of the question became, you know, I come, again, out of a community organizing background where we believe that everyday folks have knowledge and expertise about their own communities. And so the question became, would we be able to enlist hundreds of members from across our community, including folks in the business community and beyond, who actually are acting as our top of the funnel pipeline development, right? And so one of the ideas is if we can actually help build this multi-stakeholder ecosystem, that impact investors could find easier ways of moving capital into the high impact businesses that we all seek to move money towards. Another example is for community organizers. We spend so much time fighting against corporate abuse, against corrupt elected officials, working against housing displacement. But one of the questions became, could we actually, two things. One is actually, could we build the models that are representing the goals that we're fighting for in the broader economy? So if we're saying that we actually want to decommodify land because we believe that housing is a human right and that we want to actually allow land to be controlled by communities, then what role could we actually play in helping seed and create land trusts that are modeling that broader demand that we're fighting for in the political system? But another goal or another strategy here is that as community organizers, for example, when we were working on the ban the box strategy in Massachusetts to try to eliminate that question about on job applications about if you've been convicted of a felony, a lot of the work we did was finding business owners who were already doing that or were willing to do that, and for us to be able to hold them up as models, to give them the props and recognition that they deserve, but also show other business owners that it's not the end of the world, right? And so part of the opportunity for organizers was to build closer relationships with high road enterprises that were advancing our political agendas. And then finally, for business owners, of course, one of the biggest challenges beyond capital is just how do you survive in a community when you're competing against Walmart or Amazon? And so one of the strategies that Ujima, with the over 400 members that Nia mentioned earlier, is pursuing is actually activating our membership base to become a consumer base for these local businesses. So these are just examples of the ways that the intersectional strategy are allowing, we believe, us to solve for each other some of the key barriers that we have in advancing our own goals that all these stakeholders have in building racial justice and fighting the racial wealth gap in Boston. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so finally, this leads us to the Ujima Fund itself, and I'm going to hand it back to Nia in a second. But the essential premise here, as I was getting at earlier, was, or maybe not the essential premise, but one of them is that as we engage communities in actually planning where that investment capital should go, as we allow for individuals to invest their own money into that plan, and as we actually vote and allow people to execute their dreams, would this allow us to leverage a new kind of social capital that allows us to de-risk investing in a way that moves capital to businesses and enterprises that were not eligible for financing before? So put another way, the things like helping businesses get purchasing contracts from anchor institutions, the idea of getting a whole community to wrap around these businesses, the fact that these very businesses that are getting investment are asked for by the community, are beloved by the community, do all these factors actually allow us to move capital to things that the traditional market or disconnected investors would otherwise see as too risky? And so our belief is that we have incredible talent, gifts, abilities in our own communities, and that although we have been left out of access to traditional finance, that if we could wrap around our entrepreneurs and leverage all the assets that we have, that we can actually create new viable investment opportunities. So I'm going to leave it there and hand it back to you. Yeah.
Before you step off, Aaron, there was a question from Mandy about the relationship between the Center for Economic Democracy and the Boston Ujima Project, if you want to address that quickly.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that question. So Center for Economic Democracy is a 501c3, and we act as a fiscal agent for Ujima. So technically, Ujima is a project of CED. But in addition to providing fiscal sponsorship services, myself and a number of other CED staff play different programmatic roles to help support the kind of incubation of this project. So from CED's perspective, we see our role as helping support and incubate Ujima as an independent organization that has its own self-governance. And our long-term interest is learning from the Ujima process and supporting other communities and doing some of this work in conjunction with Ujima. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. So in executing our strategy, one of the first things that we did, and if you could go to the next slide, please, Andrea, I'd appreciate it, was our community standards process. So we've talked a little bit about decision making and where we're centering the decision making, access to traditional investment process, transforming the investment process, and one of the key pieces of our process is the community standards piece. So not only are we interested in who owns the businesses that we're investing in, for example, and not only are we interested in who is served by the entities that we're investing in, we're also interested in the how. So not just the who and not just the what, but also the how. We also know when we think about the historical disinvestment in our communities and when we think about conventional conversations, we also know that there have also historically been parallel conversations by community members with regard to the same decisions. So while, as Aaron said, we have not been a part, we've not had access to the traditional finance process, and we've not been a part of larger dominant conversations, it doesn't mean that there have not been conversations. And those conversations, unfortunately, have historically either been dismissed or just outright ignored. And so I think our community standards process is a process that recognizes that and is intentional about bringing that into our overall process. And I think this is probably where we should go to the next slide. So what we did with this particular process was we had about a 4-month period where each week we meet weekly. We do weekly member meetings that are open to the public. And from January to April, each week, we had our members, and this was also open to the public, weigh in on one of multiple categories. Initially, we had a list of about 90 standards that we were looking at. Those standards were largely generated by Aaron, and he largely derived them from previous work. For example, he mentioned his work with Boston Workers Alliance, and we also referenced our grassroots partners and really drew upon their pre-existing works. We were not repeating conversations. And so a lot of the original standards that we started off with were standards that were pre-existing, and then there were a few that we did some original thinking on. So from January to April, every week we had our members dig in, and we had our members, we really gave them an opportunity because we do have a multi-stakeholder structure, and we don't know down to the finest detail the expertise that each person is bringing. So this was really an open process for people to bring in whatever input that they had in each of these different categories. We then held our first elected. We then had held our first election for our first member representative body, which was our Community Standards Committee, and that happened in April. What I should say about that process was we were very intentional about seeing that as a learning process and about seeing that as one that's generative and one that we can iterate from. And so what I mean by that is initially our voting period was a week long. We said that 51% of our members need to vote for it to be a legitimate vote. And we then want 51%. We then want 51% of that 51% to be people of color. We saw that when the first week period ended, we had not actually reached that 51% threshold. And so we extended the election period 2 weeks. And what I appreciated about this effort was that was us signaling the importance of voice for our members, and it was signaling the importance of participation. So it was not a symbolic effort, and it was not, I'm trying to find the right word, but essentially we didn't go through the motions, say we did it, and then moved on to the next thing. We really made sure that we used the opportunity to figure out how can we ensure that at least 51% of our membership body is voting, so that we can actually say that this decision represents the will of our members. Yeah, I hear some typing. Is someone asking a question or someone taking notes? Just want to make sure if someone has a question, I don't skip over the question. And so we were then able to elect a community standards committee of 6 members from our general membership who just so happened to also be activists who were well beloved by communities, grounded in different fields such as housing, economic justice, health. We then also had 2 members of our business alliance, one from Haley House and one from Restaurant Opportunity Center United. And the job of that body was to then take all of the input that had been provided by our members, add their own. So there was a series of meetings where they added their own, they went through the standards themselves, and then they had to deliberate on what the members provided. So they were charged with then deciding whether or not there were, if there was common ground, that was simple enough, there was common ground. In instances where there were gaps, they then had to decide whether or not they wanted to add to the common ground with what members had suggested, or whether or not they would keep it out, and then they then had to go through why. And that was in the interest of transparency, so that we could be able to report back to members. For example, with community ownership, you said that all of the businesses must be a co-op. We are not saying that this is a minimum criteria right now for this reason. And so really being able to have that level of transparency, and so that members can see where their voice plays in the process, and they could see how their voice went to the decision making, and they could see the connection between what their input was and what the final decision was. So that was a very important part of our process. If we can go to the next slide. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. I thought if we can go back a bit. Yep. So, and then if you look at this slide, it says here, examples from our 2018 approved standards. We had our citywide assembly in October, and this is where members who were present that day, and we do have to say, that day we didn't actually get 51% of our membership body voting on that, so we actually just had a conversation today about what we would do to rectify that. And so we've made a decision that with the community standards piece in particular, we will hold a vote to engage a larger membership body, people who are not able to be there fit in person that day, to make sure that they also have a chance to weigh in and actually ratify the standards. But what we did in October was, for people who were present that day, we used a system, or we used a platform called Mentimeter, and we had a threshold, and I believe we said something like, if 80% of the people who were present, and we chose a higher threshold than 51%, because we didn't anticipate that we would not have 51% of the membership body in that space. So we chose a higher threshold. We said if 80% of the people who are present here approve these standards, then we can consider it approved. And so that did happen that day. We have our first vote coming up this year, and that will be on where we will be keeping our money for the fund. So there is a vote that is coming up on the bank that we will use. And, as I was saying today, we've decided that in order to engage the larger membership body in that decision, we will add the community standards piece, and we will also add our neighborhood investment plans piece to that vote, so that we can then really officially say 51% of our membership body has voted on this. And I'm checking time. How am I doing on time? Okay, and then if we could just go to the next slide really quickly, just so you can see who our grassroots partners are, who I mentioned, that we work with to work on the standards, and that we also work to for policy guidance. I won't belabor that slide, and then we can just go to the next one. And we can just go to the next slide really quickly. I mentioned the assembly in October, so you can just see a couple of photos from our Solidarity Summit, so you can just get a sense of what it looks like when we have our members in the room in person.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to take the chance, if you go to the next slide, to actually share what our investment process is. So, okay. Oh yes, and Corey is background checks. Okay, so our investment process has so far been over a year and a half of work. It's involved 5 assemblies, over 550 participants. And the basic framework that we've been using is really simple. We're asking people, what are the businesses you love? What are the businesses you need? and what are the businesses that you want to replace because they're extractive. And this simple framework has been used and built upon and refined through multiple assemblies as we build off of the knowledge that we gain in the first one. And so practically what this means is that we left our October assembly with a ratified list, which, as you said, actually we're going to run through one more sort of participatory okay. But of all the businesses in our 3 core neighborhoods, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, that people say that they love and they want to support, we also identified over 100 different things that people said were missing or needed in our communities. And what we were able to do was actually narrow this list of needs down to a list of top 8. And I'll just share a couple of these needs. The top one was actually community land trusts for affordable housing and commercial real estate. We also had community-owned energy and broadband. Community-owned energy is another major priority, as well as community or publicly owned broadband. We also heard people talking about the need for multicultural cooperative childcare. And so these are the kinds of community-level economic interventions that through this planning process people have prioritized and identified. And so the idea is that we do these sort of very active, and we use theater and games and engagement and help people sort of brainstorm and think about the places that they're spending money that they're happy with and what's missing and what needs to change. And that then leads to the creation of our investment plan, and that leads us into the second piece, which is a screening and analysis. And I'm just going to move a little bit more quickly now. So once we have our plan, if you, for example, are named in a business as a business that we love, our fund manager, Lucas, will reach out to you and say, hey, you've been identified as a business that the community really wants to support. The first step for you is, if you want to get involved with Ujima, is to go through our community standards process, which is what Nia was describing earlier. You have to meet the 36 minimum standards that our community has articulated essentially as the essential ESG screens for global investing that precedes your ability to get any kind of support from us. But if you do pass that, then you can enter into the Ujima Business Alliance. And then from there, you can become eligible to get into due diligence process. And so the screening and analysis is sort of making sure that they met the community standards, and then to see if they're actually interested in investment. The third step then is our due diligence process. And here is our effort to sort of mix the broad-based knowledge of the community and bringing that together with the focus, expertise of investment professionals that are on our investment committee. So on our investment committee, we're very proud to have a number of prominent local investors and finance experts who are doing, some who are investment advisors and others who have been doing impact investing, including folks like Deborah Fries, again, with Boston Impact Initiative. And their function is not to decide, whether or not we invest in a business or not, but rather to take the guidance of the collective investment plan and to start working our way through this plan and actually bringing their expertise to bear. So someone might say, we love this particular business, and we got them through the Business Alliance screen. And now the committee is responsible for actually doing, the same due diligence that we do in any direct investment in a place. But the main difference is, instead of that committee then deciding whether or not to move forward, they will take all that data, synthesize it, and make it available to the community to then review. One other important step, though, is that we actually believe that the community has very valuable information to share through our due diligence process as well. So we like to talk about how, a disconnected investor, you might have someone come and pitch to you, and they might be really smooth. But actually, everyone in the community knows that they are shady and are crook, for example, right? And we might not know that. But if you ask the community, you would. And on the flip side, you might have someone who seems rough around the edges, who might not meet your profile of who you think is investable. But then when you ask the community what role they play, that you have hundreds of people say, oh, we know this person, we trust them, and they're trustworthy, and we want to support them, right? And so this additional layer of community expertise is getting integrated into the due diligence process, that then once the recommendation is made back to the members, they have the opportunity to either move ahead with that deal or deny it. Our hope is that because all of the pipeline is actually being dictated by the investment plans, that really by the time we get to this fund allocation and this final vote, and if it's a strong recommendation from the investment committee, that people will be excited to move forward. But you can see sort of the 3 different points at which everyday folks are able to weigh in and approve sort of Ujima's investment process. And then finally, we have the monitoring and support, which like any other, investor like we will sort of take almost in the way that a VC investment would sort of wrap around staffing and really make sure that this particular investment was successful. We obviously don't have the staff capacity to be placing people and working, half time for each of our portfolio companies, but we do have literally hundreds of volunteers who already have started bringing their various skills to bear to make sure that our companies are supported and successful. And what's really important is that we're transparent about when things start going wrong so that our members aren't taken, and this was actually something that they expressed very clearly. They say, we want to know that if things aren't going well, not because we want to punish them, but we want to be able to step in and support. And so this is part of our proposition about the role of social capital and actually helping allow for new investments to move. So let's go to the next slide. Andrea, next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So as I spoke earlier, here's a quick list of some of the top needs that were identified. This is a separate list from the existing businesses that we already want to support and stabilize. And this is sort of the future opportunities that people so far had said that they wanted to apply capital towards. And just to say really quickly, earlier I was talking more about the how do we finance the businesses that exist strategy. For these things that are new, essentially what we'll do is now that we have a list of top priorities, we're moving into feasibility studies where people can learn more about what the costs and implications and benefits of each of these strategies would be. And then we would do a further cut to prioritize what we really want to dig into. And then ultimately, once we say, hey, we all agree that we want to have, say, community land trust and we want to put money behind that, then we would put out an RFP to the broader community to say who here knows how to build and run community land trust and would like to apply for financing, or who here, for example, has done community-owned internet and knows about mesh networks and wants to actually apply to Ujima to receive that financing. And then the members in that case would actually vote between the different applicants who are putting in proposals for RFPs, and we would do due diligence on their experience and all the other parts of their application. So I hope this makes sense. It's we try to keep it simple, but there are a number of moving parts to this strategy. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we said earlier again, the goal is, again, to shop there, promote for them, advocate, finance, and organize. And we'll come back to this a little bit, but I talked a lot about the sort of direct spending that consumers can move, but the advocacy and organizing is also really important. Part of our belief is that as people start engaging and investing in businesses, say you invest in the fund, you vote for a local grocery store, and then you see the grocery store is struggling. And then meanwhile, Boston just gave, last year, over $25 million of a tax break to GE to relocate to Boston. And part of our theory is that as people are actually literally invested in the health of their local economies in the context of a political organization and movement that Ujima is trying to build, that we'll start to actually ask, well, why can't we get some of those subsidies to support our own local economy? Why is the financing that's available for large corporations so much more preferable than what we have for our own communities, right? And so a lot of the theory is that we actually get people to start thinking more structurally about the conditions that allow businesses to succeed as we get deeper into having them invested in supporting them. Okay, next slide. So finally, on this section here, we spoke about the number of interventions that our members could make to support the viability of these businesses. But I also just want to mention that we have a technical assistance network of other TA providers that we're partnering with who've agreed to give, for example, subsidized or free seats in their classes or other kinds of one-on-one support. The other one, number 3, that I just want to mention is that we actually have a major anchor institution strategy that many of you are also familiar with. Folks at Democracy Collaborative and others have helped pioneer. And we are in conversation with multiple hospitals. We have member businesses that are currently in contract negotiation with them, as well as have launched a major multi-faith network of houses of worship and faith institutions across the city of Boston that are now directing their procurement towards our Business Alliance members. Next slide. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is move into the fund structure, just to make sure that we sort of touch on the core capital stack, and you could see sort of the basic pieces. So I just want to sort of share each tranche and sort of explain the thinking behind this. So the top layer, the Kuji Chakalia note, which means self-determination, is for non-accredited investors based in Massachusetts, and you see that It's a 3% annual return and term length of 3 years. The second note is the Umoja note, which is intended predominantly for accredited investors across the country, has a higher minimum investment. And you'll notice that the 7-year note is at 3%, but the 3-year note is actually at 2%. And that will be sort of the predominant, in terms of the volume of capital, we expect to have the most from that. Of course, the number of investors, we expect to have several hundred over the lifetime of this fund in the Kuji-Takalia note. The third is the Nia note, which is, we talk about its philanthropic investment. And I think what's important to note is that the Kuji-Takalia and Umoja notes are senior to the Nia note. And the purpose of the Nia note and the Imani gift below it are essentially to predominantly act as a risk reserve to help secure portions of the Kuji-Takalia and Umoja notes. And so what you have here, and our hope is that we will have foundations in particular that are trying to figure out how to move program-related investments to put money into this pool, as well as folks who potentially have DAF investments and have already written off their contribution to the DAF and currently have it invested in other things and are waiting before they deploy them as grants. And part of our theory is that if you feel good about Ujima, and if you end up taking a small loss because you're actually helping secure and leverage all kinds of other capital, that someone may see that just as beneficial and impactful as giving a grant. And so doing, this particular part of the capital stack would be accommodating folks who are especially mission aligned and have the risk tolerance for their particular kind of capital for this note. And finally, the Imani note is gift capital, which would be the most exposed and most subordinate part of our capital stack. So any losses that we incur would first be drawn out of the Imani note. Now, I should just mention that this sort of multi-tranche capital stack, we really learned from Pioneer Valley Grows Fund, which was a fund that Solidago Foundation and others in Western Massachusetts had pioneered. And then Boston Impact Initiative, which also launched a $10 million fund earlier last year, took some of those elements and turned it into a similar capital stack. Our sort of final innovation, though, is actually balancing out the 3% returns for Kuji-Takalia holders and making it equivalent to the 7-year notes. And what we know is that this disrupts the traditional risk return framework, that because the Umoja 7-year notes have a longer term, theoretically they have a higher risk profile, and so you would expect them to also take a higher return. However, as a political project, and as an effort to model the future of how we think finance should operate, we're expanding, as Andrea mentioned earlier, our conception of what risk actually means. And so a key part of that is actually saying that non-accredited local investors, for them losing $100 may be much, much more meaningful than someone who is very wealthy losing $1 million, for example. And so what we're trying to do is give more risk protections to the Kuji-Takalia note holders, but also use it as an opportunity to build some level of meaningful wealth. At least, 3% is much better than the checking accounts or the under the mattress savings that a lot of our members and people in our community are holding our money. And so we see this as a sort of redistribution within a sort of capital stack equity within sort of the framework that we're building. Okay, and then next slide, please. Oh, and this is actually fundraising strategy, Nia, so if you want to jump back in. So we're just going to go for a few more minutes, and then we'll quickly move into questions and then have Ted close this out.
Okay, great. Thank you, Aaron. Yeah. So I also just want to apologize really quickly. I realized I did something earlier that Andrea warned us about doing, and that's I presume that everyone could see the slide when I was speaking, and I know some people are on the phone that can't, so my apologies for that. So really quickly, there's just one piece that we really wanted to highlight with our fundraising strategy, and that's our member organizing piece. So one piece of our fundraising strategy is to actually enroll our members in the task of enrolling their networks as well. And I think this is interesting because it provides us an additional opportunity to do some education where necessary, because our members will have to feel comfortable enough to talk about the fund themselves, to then talk about their network, or to then talk about investing in the Ujima Fund and why it's something that they would recommend to their network. And the way we're doing this is we are holding regular fund workshops. So we already had our first one when the fund launched December 12th. We have another one that's coming up in a couple of weeks. And our plan is to schedule a fund workshop at least once a month and to provide regular opportunities for our members and the general public to get into the nuts and bolts of the fund. And then also organize investor organizer workshops. And so then these are workshops specifically for members who have said, yes, I now, in addition to investing, I now want to undertake the task of now talking to my network about the fund and learning about the best way to talk about the fund and to enroll people in Ujima overall. So that's a key part of our task. And we also do plan to hold these workshops in concert with our grassroots partners as well. So we're now in the last section. We'll talk where Aaron, I'll turn it over back to Aaron, and he'll talk about where we are now and how we got here.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we're just going to wrap up our section, and then Andrea, it sounds like you're suggesting we go to Jed and then do questions. And that sounds great. So Jed, if you're cool, we'll have you go jump in a second. But as you can see on your slide, we've had 5 community assemblies, over 550 participants, our voting members, and our and so again, like this planning process has been very robust. We have 10 member teams that are volunteering that we haven't even talked about, which includes a time banking strategy, building a local currency, investor education, a number of other things. But I think I actually just because a little bit because there were just technical challenges, we're running a little behind. I just want to take one kind of major step back about what Ujima is really trying to do in relation to how we think about scale and impact, and then I'll ask Jed to jump in. So, you know, a lot of people talk about how Ujima, we're a $5 million fund, and we say that that's very significant for our communities, and we think that we could do some real good with that money. But, you know, in the context of broader finance capital, it's a negligent amount of capital. And so for us, you know, there's a number of different ways that we think about scaling and replication. So one is obviously just growing the fund, and we do hope to do that if we're successful over the next several years and grow a larger fund that could help us be more self-sustaining. We should mention that Ujima's operations are predominantly covered through donations and grants. And, you know, as the fund grows, we hope that more of those operations be covered through the actual operating income from the fund. The second strategy, of course, is helping other communities take some of the learnings from our model. And as Andrea said, we can't just, it's not a plug and play model because it's so dependent on the conditions on the ground and the different kinds of stakeholders, but certainly helping other people model democratically governed investment funds. But the third piece that I just want to share is sort of the broader vision for how this translates into political power and more societal level transformation and impacting broader levels of capital. So yesterday we actually had the launch of, and Ujima was the co-founder of this new citywide network that is a Divest Invest network. And this included over 60 people representing the prison abolition community, climate justice, folks who are working on militarization and occupation, as well as housing and land. And we had a great cross-section also of shareholder activist leaders, a number of RIAs that are pretty prominent in the city. And so we're building this new network that is actually moving on the city of Boston. We're going to have a hearing in a few months to talk about where our pension funds are held, as well as where the city is banking. And so we believe that Ujima is actually animating a conversation at the community level about what we do with our own money and who controls it and where it goes, right? And so as we start getting people involved in the governance of our own money, a small fund, we really like this phrase that Movement Generation uses. They say the heart learns what the hands do. So as we get people's hands dirty governing this $5 million fund, the question becomes, well, why can't we do this with our own tax dollars, right? Why is it that our pension money is being dictated by someone else, is going into the exact things that we don't want? And our hope is that through this broader political movement that we're actually building the hunger and the appetite of everyday folks to start governing our own capital beyond our own small fund that we control. And ultimately, the conversation we were having yesterday was, what would it look like for everyday folks that have control over their pensions, for us to think about the creation of a municipal public bank that was actually lending down to the community level using democratic and participatory processes. And in this way, we hope to be seeding a vision for what the true democratization in capital could look like, because ultimately our position is that one of the major flaws of capitalism is that those with wealth get to decide where where financing capital and value goes. And so long as that is true, even if all of us are acting benevolently, if we're not truly accountable to communities who actually have the expertise and are impacted by these decisions, that at best will continue to misdirect capital in ways that predominantly benefit those who already have wealth and continue to leave out communities from which that wealth has been extracted. So that's sort of our big vision and sort of the long-term hope that we're trying to drive towards. With that, I'd love to turn it either directly to Jed or Andrea if you wanted to just jump in and make the transition.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Nia. Yeah, let's turn it over for a moment to Jed Emerson, founder of the Blended Value Group, to give us some of his remarks. And meanwhile, for all the attendees, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box for Jed or for Nia and Aaron, or for me as well. Jed, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, it's my pleasure. I just want to check. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can see and we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. I will keep my comments very brief because this is a complicated kind of interlocking set of strategies. And so I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to unpack that in the discussion period. I think it's important, though, to understand Ujima in the context of the larger movement that is in motion now with regard to capital, and especially the brand of impact investing. And when we talk about the whole notion of mainstreaming impact, it's important, I think, that we understand that mainstreaming does not necessarily mean democratizing. That, in fact, when we celebrate, BlackRock introducing a whole new suite of impact ETFs, sustainable ETFs, when we celebrate funds that are now billion-dollar funds, TPG Rise, KKR, others, and when we talk about the idea of using monetary metrics like the multiplier that TPG Rise introduced recently, which is a variation on strategies that a lot of us have used over the years, but really focuses more on the issue of how money moves and what is needed for money to move at scale, which are important issues. We need more capital to come into this space, but we also need capital that is structured in certain ways that advances the impact that we are all really seeking to have in this conversation. And I think that what's interesting about what Ujima is doing is that they're really in the process of innovating in terms of the overall process of capital management and allocation, and not simply innovating relative to the products that we're being offered to invest in. They're seeking to scale not just their firm, if you will, but a set of practices that I think really have great promise relative to our ability to drive capital for community interest as opposed to engage with communities in order to advance the interests of capital. And so what we're really talking about is, I think, a set of different relationships that we're describing not only between asset owners and the object of investment, if you will, but among the community itself. And when you look at the process that Ujima is executing, when you see who comes to these sessions and you recognize the intergenerational nature of the dialogue and the conversation, the cross-cultural nature of that, the fact that you have business owners and community residents in conversation with capital with regard to performance and what does it mean to have effective performance of capital, when you consider the issues related to risk sharing and the tranches of risk and opportunity that are offered investors, I'm reminded in some ways of some of the practices within Islamic finance, which basically say that risk really should be shared by both sides and not simply a function of the entrepreneur carrying that risk and the capital owner kind of providing for themselves and benefiting from both the upside and the downside of that risk equation. I think there are also issues that get raised here, again, in terms of the metrics part of this discussion, that we need to advance, as a recent Medium post has been exploring, qualitative systems thinking and analysis that allows us to kind of take our traditional quantitative metrics and wrap them with qualitative considerations of performance. And I think that's the last thing I'll just end on, is to say that in some ways, yes, we need to be looking for kind of how to scale these types of models and practices. But what we're really looking at is how do you take principles of practice and bring those elsewhere, not only geographically, but in other aspects of the capital market, in order to explore how do you best structure capital in a way that really attains its full purpose and possibility with regard to serving really as a fuel and a vehicle for individuals to pursue their goals and their visions and their ideas in the context of family and community, all wrapped with the interests of society and the earth. So I'm really excited about what the Ujima team is advancing, and I think we all will have a lot to learn from their experiences over the coming months and years. And on that note, let me just turn it back to you for the question and answer period. There's a lot of good questions in the stack right now.
Great. Thank you so much, Jed, and Nia and Aaron, please feel free to jump in. One thing I wanted to lift up from what Jed was saying, because I think it's very important in the context of some of the earlier discussions that we've had within the investor network, is this point around the principles of practice, as he said, and how that interplays with what, somewhat pompously we have called this meta-impact, or the impact of showing new impact practices in the field, right? So if I understood what Jed was saying and what Aaron was lifting up earlier, there is the direct impact on the community, where this $5 million as a start is actually a very meaningful amount of money, even though, BlackRock would not get out of bed for $5 million in any community. But there's that demonstrative impact, right? The way in which the other investors can think about the capital in other places, how the community locally conceives of itself as a holder, allocator of capital for over this 5 million, but also over the capital beyond that. And it's a tall order, right, to reconcile those two efforts, to have this very bespoke, very deep analysis of the type of capital that is needed locally and allocated properly, while also having the eyes of the nation on you, as it were, and this almost responsibility that you've taken on to provide a model for both the investors and for other communities that want to reclaim ownership and governance over the capital. So with that reflection, I saw, as Jed said, there are a lot of very good questions in the chat. Just quickly to Delilah's practical question, yeah, we'll send out the Medium post in the follow-up email with the video link. And Jed, if you have it handy, if you want to put it in the chat box, that works too. Over to you, Nia, and Aaron, I will unmute you.
Thank you. Jed, thank you so much for your reflections. It's really meaningful for someone like yourself who's been in this work for such a long time and helped build the field to lend your vote of confidence. And the same is true for you, Andrea. So thank you both. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of these questions and would love to just, Andrea, if it makes sense, we could just run through some of them. Yeah. So let's start with the first kind of question I see right here is, do voting members vote on all term sheets, and what is the mechanism for this vote? So as we were saying earlier, yes, essentially what will happen is that after sort of a robust due diligence process and we get feedback from members, the investment committee will essentially offer structure a deal that we think is most appropriate. And we do think that's really important to be able to balance sort of the nuances of deal structuring and making sure that we're giving the right terms for the success of the business, while sort of like bringing the vast knowledge of communities to bring to bear so that we're doing this correctly. And just very practically, so yes, everyone will vote on the final term sheets, and that will be likely done, for the most part, will be done virtually. Okay. So the second one on gentrification, how does gentrification impact these communities and the ability for intended businesses and community members to be invested in? That's a huge issue. We've done some membership. You want to talk about membership? How people displaced out of the city?
Oh, absolutely, sure. And I referenced this a little bit earlier when I was talking about the local context and talking about affordable housing. Definitely, gentrification and displacement are huge forces in Boston. At one point, A few years ago, I think Boston was number 3 for inequality according to Brookings, and then it had moved up to number 1, and also at one point it was considered the top gentrifying city in the country. That's changed a bit since those stats have come out. Those are stats that are probably about 2 or 3 years old now, but I imagine Boston has definitely not fallen off of that list and it's not fallen out of the top 10. So on that note, when thinking about so a question that comes up and that we imagine will continue to come up is when we say local, what do we mean by local? And then one of the reasons that question does come up is because of the impact of gentrification and displacement. One of the ways we are addressing that with our membership, at least right now, is we have 2 broad tiers of membership: general membership for people who are residents of Boston proper, and solidarity memberships for people who live outside of Boston. And we have, I think, 2 things that address both gentrification and displacement. One is we encourage people to self-organize and to think about whether or not they should take out a general membership or a solidarity membership if they do live in Boston proper and they don't identify as a person of color, as a working class person. And so that's an option that we open up to everyone who's applying that I think is a useful prompt to think about their current place in the city, as well as how they would impact participation in Ujima. The second thing is our general membership, our voting membership is open to people who also identify as people who would actually say Boston is their home, but they have been displaced. So we do have some people, for example, who live in Bridgewater, or they live in Brockton or Worcester, but Boston has been their home for years, and so they do take out a voting membership.
Thank you. So then, Kwaku, thank you for the note on community on internet. And let's move to Leonardo's question. Basically raising the question about how, this seems like it's a lot of money and costs and a lot of coordination costs. And I think that is absolutely true. So as we said earlier, especially with the amount of money that we're deploying, over $5 million fund, and our max deal size we've anticipated is about $250,000. So we see doing between 25K to 250. And so there's no doubt that this is extraordinary amount of additional staffing and labor that a traditional fund would not have to do, and is currently dependent on grants. And so that honestly is a really valid question. We think that there's ways that this, despite it being a heavy upfront cost, that there's going to be cost savings and efficiencies that we can gain on the back end. But the reality is that we don't know how that plays out in comparison until we actually do it. So just to say though, as I mentioned earlier, we do think that we have a major advantage, a competitive advantage on our deal flow because we have hundreds of community members and businesses that are referring companies to us. So our pipeline is really robust. The due diligence and the expertise of the community, we believe, will help us make better investment decisions, and hopefully will reduce some of losses that other place-based impact funds might have to incur. And then furthermore, we are very explicit and transparent about the costs of running this project. And so that's something that our members and our stakeholders all understand. And, just as integrated capital is about, on the deployment side, offering grants when you need it for a business plan or a combination of debt and equity, having that flexibility is important on the deployment. But we also try to raise that framework for our investors to say, hey, and if you're an individual or foundation, you could think about what do I have to give to support this project more broadly as a tax-deductible donation? What is it that I want to hold for long-term security and principal preservation? Is there other capital that is somewhere in between that I could put into the loss reserve, right? And so a lot of this is helping us think and see this project as a community-controlled and owned project and having all of us take responsibility for its own management. So I hope that, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so you might hear me coughing every now and then. So I think just the last piece that I'll add to that is, so Andrea has referred to the demonstrative value of the project. So for us, we're learning as well. And what I hope is some of the very intricate coordination that's required now as we're learning and as we're refining. will be less so later on down the line. And so we'll start to see those costs in terms of time and actual costs diminish as we reiterate as well.
Yes. I mean, honestly, like every single assembly, we are literally making up as we go because we are making this up as we go. And it's an incredibly fulfilling, exciting process, and we learn a lot through each assembly. And we've done, over half a dozen, or we've done 5 official assemblies and a bunch of community gatherings since then. So we are learning and hope to improve that. Okay, so the next question was just clarity on the Umoja note, and thanks for that question. So the Umoja note, as I said earlier, is available to accredited investors, individuals, and institutions anywhere in the U.S. as well as UK and Canada. But there's also Umoja notes that are available to non-accredited investors, but only right now in Mass, Connecticut, Maine, and Rhode Island. And we are hoping to extend that to New York State either this year or early next year. But we're really mostly just limited by some of the blue sky laws that prevented us from making this available to non-accredited investors across the country. And we know, we have lots of friends and supporters who would have thrown in a small piece just because they want to be abreast and connected to the project, and will only be able to do that in the New England states. And of course, however, I should note that anyone from across the country can be a Solidarity member and be part of this project, contribute, and give feedback and help us grow. So we encourage anyone to do that. Okay. And then there's a question about what are the challenges you face working with existing city, state government institutions or budgeting policy? What needs to change to support this model? I'm not sure if I'm fully, because there's lots of different challenges that we would face in the public sector. Do you have a take on this? You want to?
Sure. And I guess what needs to change to support this model?
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So I was just going to say, maybe here's where we do talk a little bit about. We are having several conversations with the city, not yet the state. And I don't know if you want to jump in here and talk about some of the conversations. I think one where we may run into limitations, but it isn't anything big, is we are in a conversation with the city, a particular city agency, about some parcels of land that they own, and we're talking about partnering Ujima's process with them because they're having trouble moving that land. And really the only limitation, that's a small one, is just thinking about conflict of interest. So then when we just think about ultimately who will develop that land, we just have to think very carefully about where we appear in that process. That's one thing that comes to mind immediately.
I think it's helpful to actually note, earlier I was talking about how this project came out of a network of predominantly like grassroots social justice organizers. And so most of our lives are spent often, in contentious relationship with the city, beating up on city, trying to get them to do something that we need them to do. And for this particular project, we made a very explicit strategic decision to build this fund independent of government support. We didn't want to be in a place where we needed someone to give us the okay to do this, beyond obviously following all the rules and laws. And so that was part of our strategy to say we have money that we can pull ourselves. There's other aligned people who want to participate. And so that has been part of it. But as we've grown, we are very connected to city government. And I think there is a question about, can the city, for example, help put money into the philanthropic bucket or provide a loan guarantee for the fund? We've already gotten the city actually to make their first loan to a worker-owned cooperative last year, and that co-op is called Cerro Co-op. They're one of our founding members. And so there has been a generative but still early dialogue with the city about how they can really engage in supporting things like Ujima. And then, as I said earlier, there's kind of a broader political conversation about where does the city put, its corpus and the rest of the money that it's holding. So that's something that'll be a much longer-term strategy over time. Okay, so then the next one we're going to jump to is the cultural gap. How do we manage the cultural gap between investors and community?
Sure. So I think one way to answer that question is it depends on what types of investors we are talking about. So one of our taglines when you go to our website is "Everyone is an investor." So I think that may be a bit of a universal cultural gap that we address, is being sure to acknowledge the multi-dimensionality of our members. And so to make sure when we talk about our members and when we talk about community members, we don't narrowly box them or have them in one bucket. And so I think we then move from there. I think we are careful not to make any presumptions about where people may be, for example, in terms of financial literacy or even in terms of familiarity with investing. I think what we've seen is that people are all over the place. And so we're very intentional about, I think, being sure to trying to address multiple backgrounds at the same time.
Yeah. So I think that's, first of all, sort of like breaking down, right, the silos of who we consider to be investors and expanding that. And then I think there's this very specific question on what kind of trainings to offer around anti-oppression. And I think that's a really important question. So there's one side, which is with community members who may or may not have familiarity with investment. We know that like money can be a triggering topic for some people, and so we do a lot of work. Culture, arts, we haven't mentioned, we have an ongoing lecture and art series where we grapple with some of these questions around extraction, history of a need for reparations, cooperatives, and helping people embody sort of power that we believe we ought to have in governing our own capital. And then there's folks who are very comfortable governing capital and have been doing so for a long time. And for those folks, we have been trying to be really intentional because we need, this is explicitly a multiracial, multi-class project that's rooted and centered with working class people of color, but it is a broad cross-section of people we want to bring in. And to that end, we have, for example, at our assembly, we had a whole skit that we actually had some people, white members of our staff team and others, to develop on how we actually want white folks in a multiracial space and wealthy people to be acting in relation to each other. How do we prioritize listening and learning as opposed to sort of exerting the expertise that people think they're entitled to exert. We also are currently building our capacity around restorative justice practices. So we know that there's going to be conflict in this organization. And so we've started training people to actually learn how to do, initially starting to think about how do we teach people to do restorative justice circles to deal with conflict. And we anticipate, and we've already had some issues where, we've had a predominantly Black assembly in a neighborhood, and there are some white folks who were new to the neighborhood and were taking up a lot of space and was triggering for folks. And so we've actually had processes to deal with these, and we continue to learn. And we're also hoping to partner, we've talked with our local resource generation chapter because they do a lot of work with folks of wealth and helping them come correct in the ecosystem that we're trying to build. And so these are all really important questions that we are sort of dealing with as we grow.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that quickly at the cost of seeming to plug the work that Eric Horvath is leading here at Transform Finance. So in our broader effort beyond the investor network to create this bridge between traditional finance and the world of social justice, we have seen that, to Marjorie's point, there is a lot of need for creating a common language, for sharing practices on both sides. And we've seen that both groups have done, I think, meaningful work, right? What you could consider traditional investors or finance professionals, as opposed to we all are investors in a way to sit back, to listen, to change their practices generally, as well as learning about how the principles of social justice, the principles of community leadership show up in their work. And similarly, we've seen from the social justice practitioners, community leaders, and activist groups a willingness to be in a position where their message can be heard more meaningfully by investors that, while they might be well-meaning in some ways, are just not attuned to a different style of communication, to different concepts that get presented. And, it's been painstaking work, to be honest. We've been doing the Institute for Social Justice Leaders for over 5 years now, and getting, inch by inch closer, but starting to see a little bit of the results where both groups can ultimately converge and see that there are perhaps more similarities than there are differences. And to Nia's super fundamental point, right, as human beings, we're not just one or the other. Many are wearing both hats and tend to step into that one persona, depending on the hat that they're being asked to wear there, and kind of push the other one to the outside, right? You have folks that are activists in the evening and work at Goldman during the day, and trying to figure out how you can break down that that distinction. And if any of you is interested in that work or has recommendations for example, Marjorie brought up the anti-oppression piece that we might want to incorporate in our work, please do let us know what you've seen as practices that work. And more generally, Aaron and I, as well as Rodney Foxworth at Bali, have started a conversation a while back that we should really pick up on sort of consolidating and bringing together all these training efforts that there are and good practices, starting to document what has worked in terms of breaking down some of those barriers and building those bridges. So anyone on the webinar that is interested in that piece of work or might have a curriculum that they have developed, it would be great to be more collaborative and sort of learn from each other's work there. There is one additional question that came offline, both for Nia and Aaron and for Jed, and it's something that I must say I myself have struggled with in terms of how we reconcile these efforts that are deeply intentional, deeply rooted in a political vision with good, not great, or great, not perfect efforts at moving capital in communities. And I imagine it's the case in Boston that you have some capital moving in good ways that are not deeply democratic and could be both, in a sense, strengthening the work of the Boston Ujima Project, but can also be detrimental to it by being a less politically concrete alternative. Let's put it that way, right? And I think it's a problem that Jed, Anand, and others have been exploring in this space of, right, this like escape valves for finance where you do something a little bit better. And I think there's a point on that a little bit better where it gets better enough that it can become a collaboration, even with something that is more on the radical edge. And there is a good enough that is not good enough that can be actually detrimental to some of these deeper, more transformative efforts, as we would call them, right? Where is it that something serves as a palliative that takes away attention and steam from the real thing? So any of the three of you that would like to address it?
I'd love to hear Jed, if you want to take a first cut.
Well, I mean, I think it reminds me in some ways of the whole opportunity zone conversation, where you have basically this vehicle that's been created that we've seen before. Every administration has their version of it, and it benefits first and foremost the investor, and I think secondarily, hopefully the community at some level. But I've not seen the standards, the accountability, the transparency around how we're understanding the nature of impact. And my fear with that vehicle is that in the absence of these types of dialogues, in the absence of really connecting asset owner with community resident, with local business, we're going to sidestep the harder parts of that conversation, and we will really miss out on a phenomenal opportunity to be engaged in, again, is what I've called mutual impact, where we can enter that conversation with a willingness to be transformed as much as we seek to transform others and community. And the problem really is who drives that process, who defines what is the transformation we seek. And the thing with Ujima is that you're really talking about a set of processes that put community residents in the driver's seat for that conversation. And we need to, for those who are asset owners, understand that that is the game. That is what we're trying to do. And it's a two-way street, but at the end of the day, we got to be driving kind of in a similar direction on the freeway, if you will. So, I'll just stop there, but those are some thoughts.
Thank you. I know that we're past time, so if you have anything quick you want to say, but otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just really quickly just want to double down on what Jed said when I was thinking about your question, Andrea. In this conversation, we talk about the democratization of finance. We talk about access to wealth building vehicles. And when Jed mentions opportunity zones, it just makes me think, I know one of the things we're interested in right now, for example, is just making sure that the conversation itself is open. And so I would just say that's really important as well when we think about all of the different shapes that these vehicles can take.
Cool. Thank you all so much.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. I think we did manage to cover a lot, and I also feel like it's just the beginning here. So we have there the information for Nia and Aaron. We will share that with the follow-up email. I would encourage you all to follow the work of the Boston Ujima Project and reach out with any additional questions that you might have. Again, I think we're all in a learning process, being impacted by everything that is happening, as Jed was saying, and transforming our own practices. So it would be good to hear from any of you that were on the call, your pushback on some of the elements, some of the concerns that there might be, and as well as suggestions for what else is out there that can inform our practices beyond the direct community investments with this deep democratic approach. Lastly, if you would like to learn more about the work of the Transform Finance Investor Network, please reach out to Kurt Lyon, Kurt at transformfinance.org, or to me, Andrea at transformfinance.org. And please do get in touch if you have any suggestions for other models of community-centered capital, democratization of capital you're seeing around the country, as well as elsewhere, in particular in the Global South. Jed, Nia, Aaron, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to hear about the fantastic work that you all are doing together, and look forward to the next time. All the best.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Sure.